Sounds True presents The Beginner's Guide to Contemplative Prayer, How to Pray in the Christian Mystical Tradition, with author and meditation instructor James Finley.
Whenever I speak with someone who approaches me to talk about contemplative prayer and they tell me that they're a beginner, that is, that they're just first beginning to be interiorly drawn to a more wordless, more interior form of prayer, I find myself in the dialogue to be not so much answering their questions about what contemplative prayer is and how to practice it, but rather I find myself in the dialogue inviting them to begin to appreciate or to understand the situation in which they find themselves as a beginner, and what an extraordinary and mysterious thing it is to be a beginner. Because to be a beginner in contemplative prayer means that something has already begun, in that all one's efforts to enter into contemplative prayer are one's first faltering efforts to be faithful or to be open or to be receptive to this dawning of this unit of awareness within the depths of our own heart. Now, it just so happens that in speaking of contemplative prayer in this way, we are already in the thick of things. That is, we are already speaking in fidelity to the contemplative tradition down through the ages within the mystery of Christian faith. Because most, and perhaps we might say all, contemplative literature is the attempt of the author to offer guidance and encouragement to beginners in learning to practice contemplative prayer and to surrender to it. One example of this is found in the book The Cloud of Unknowing. The Cloud of Unknowing was written by an anonymous author in the 14th century in England, most likely a disciple of Meister Eckhart. And in the foreword to his work, the anonymous author says this: "There are some presently engaged in the active life who are being prepared by grace to grasp the message of this book. I am thinking of those who feel the mysterious action of the Spirit in their inmost being, stirring them to love. I do not say they continually feel this stirring as experienced contemplatives do, but now and again they taste something of contemplative love in the very core of their being. Should such folk read this book, I believe they will be greatly encouraged and reassured." Now, the author's reference to an active way of life can be understood within the Christian tradition as the distinction made between an active way of life and those who have committed themselves to active forms of ministry in the world, as distinct from cloistered or monastic or contemplative forms of life lived by cloistered monks and nuns in monasteries. But I think in a more universal sense, he means something that more directly pertains to all of us. We might say that the person living the active life is the one who consciously, unconsciously, tends to interpret and experience themselves in terms of their actions. That is, it's the tendency to equate one's identity with what one has achieved or failed to achieve. And he says that we go about living this active way of life when there is this serendipitous moment in which we experience within ourselves this blind stirring of love in the very core of our being. It's innermost, it's intimate, it's intuitive, it's grounded within our bodies, and it cannot be accounted for in the domain of action, in the domain of that which is attained or not attained. He continues in the first chapter of his book to relate this experience to a certain progressive unfolding of various ways or stages of living the Christian life. The first stage he refers to as the common manner of living the Christian life. We might say today the cultural Christian, or the person who's in their religious tradition simply because they were born into it. They're used to it. They become accustomed to it. The next stage is what he calls the special way of life. The special way of life is the way of life that begins when one personally experiences that one is personally loved by God. Here, one's religious faith is not simply a way of meeting certain psychological needs. It is not simply a way of living up to certain internalized, unquestioned expectations. Rather, it becomes a vital or a kind of vibrant awakening of a realization of a personal relationship with Christ, or a personal relationship with God that Christ reveals to us. And then the author of The Cloud of Unknowing says, "Is there more? Yes, from the beginning, I think God's love for you was so great that his heart could not rest satisfied with this. What did he do? Do you not see how gently and how kindly he has drawn you on to the third way of life, the singular? Yes, you now live in the deep solitary core of your being, learning to direct your loving desire toward the highest and final manner of living, which I have called the perfect." The author of The Cloud of Unknowing stresses again and again in his writings that our heart is not content with the grace of God or the gifts that God gives us. The heart is only content with God naked, just as he is. And it is this taste of God naked, just as he is, that's intimately experienced in the blind stirring of love within our heart. The whole of his book is written to offer guidance and encouragement to us in learning to be childlike and open and vulnerable and receptive as to how to follow or how to be transparently obedient to this blind stirring of love. Another classical source within the Christian tradition that might help to get an initial sense of contemplative prayer is found in the writings of the 16th century Spanish mystic Saint Teresa of Avila. And in her writings she makes reference to the prayer of quiet. And she situates the prayer of quiet in terms of a certain graced evolution of consciousness that one finds throughout the writings of the Christian mystical traditions. Namely, a graced evolution of consciousness in which prayer tends to move from spiritual reading to meditation to affective prayer to the prayer of quiet or the dawning of contemplation. In spiritual reading, the prayerful reading of a word is the prayer. That is, if we sit quietly and read the Scriptures, and we read in the Scriptures that if our heart condemns us, God is greater than our hearts. By reading these words as an act of faith, we allow the truth of the word into our heart, and the cramped space of our own shame or the cramped space of our own inability to forgive ourselves begins to loosen up, and a more expansive or a more loving or more generous experience of ourself and our brokenness can begin to emerge. This process of reading in this way, that is, where the words invite transformative experiences of our heart, naturally gives way to meditation. In the Christian tradition, when the word meditation is used, it almost always refers to discursive meditation, using thoughts and images. So one reads a text, one pauses, and then allows the text to initiate an inner dialogue between oneself and God as to how the truth of this text is acting in one's life today. That is, meditation is prayerful introspection, prayerful inner dialogue, and it's the power of thought to be a medium of prayer or a medium of expressing and experiencing our relationship with God. And as it sometimes happens, as we read in the scriptures or in spiritual writings, or we meditate in this way, of God's personal love for us, it elicits within us feelings of our love for God, and our prayer becomes learning to rest in or to yield to this love. And then Teresa of Avila says, as one continues praying on in this way, one comes to the point in one's reading where one is inclined not to read the next verse. One is inclined in one's meditation not to think anything about God. One is inclined, in whatever feelings of love for God may be present, or of God's love for us, not to rest content with these feelings, but rather one is inclined to rest wordlessly in the presence of God, beyond words, beyond thought, beyond feeling. It is in the dawning of this prayer of quiet, this dawning of the inner inclination to wordlessly rest in a felt sense of oneness with God beyond thought, that one sees this arising of this passive or mystical dimension of contemplation. To obey or to follow this impulse of the heart is one's active contemplation. It is the way one actively obeys or follows this inner prompting of one's heart. I hope that by what has been said so far, you can begin to get a felt sense or an intuitive recognition of this whole domain of contemplative prayer. It's a form of prayer that has its mysterious origins in the awakening of our hearts to a realization of oneness with God beyond what we can grasp with our own thoughts or which we can express with words. Having been awakened in this way, we feel the inadequacy of a life estranged from this awareness, and we seek ways to make ourselves as receptive or open or vulnerable as possible to this graced visitation of God within the depths of our own being. Another source from the Christian contemplative traditions which might help us to get an initial feel or understanding of contemplative prayer is found in the writings of St. John of the Cross, the 16th century mystic and companion of St. Teresa of Avila. St. John of the Cross puts it this way. He says that the Christian person goes along in a life of daily fidelity to God, a life of daily prayer and loving service to others, reflecting on the life of Christ, reading the scriptures, and so forth. And at a certain point, the person begins to experience a lack of customary nurturance in this daily spiritual reading and daily meditation. That is, St. John of the Cross says, one no longer feels nurtured as one is accustomed to being nurtured by reflecting on the things of God. Simultaneously, John of the Cross says, a person notices that they are no longer nurtured by thinking of the things of the earth either. This is the dawning of what he refers to as the dark night, in which God weans us away from our customary reliance on thought, feeling, imagination, perception, and all the finite ways that we are accustomed to experiencing ourselves and moving through our life. John of the Cross goes on to say, as disconcerting as this is to us, and as disorienting as it is to us, we notice that in this emptiness, that we are interiorly drawn to rest in a general loving awareness of God without regard for anything in particular. He says that as we sit this way, it's not that we don't have thoughts, but rather, he says, it is that we are not inclined to fix our mind on any of these passing thoughts, but rather to rest wordlessly in this general loving awareness, this vast, open, spacious, unfelt, ungraspable presence, and to surrender ourself over to it. It is said of St. John of the Cross that he used to like to stay up alone late at night, sitting at an open window, looking at the moonlight pouring out over the countryside, giving himself over to whole nights of sitting in this general loving awareness or communion with God beyond thoughts, words, and images. John of the Cross says that there are many people who have been interiorly led or drawn or invited to this more wordless, intimate, unitive experience of God, long before they begin to realize they are drawn to it. Because in our customary tendency to stay with the more immediately accessible noise of our own thoughts, the more immediately accessible or tangible sense of our own emotions, he says we do not afford ourselves the inner quietude, the inner subtle, open, receptive attentiveness in which we can begin to experience within ourselves this extremely subtle dawning of a unitive realization of oneness with God beyond thoughts and images. Finally, I would like here to expand our point of reference out to take into account the ways in which the Christian tradition understands contemplative prayer as having its grounding in Christ, and to move on from there to see how the contemplative tradition has unfolded down over the centuries, right up to and including your own present experience of yourself as a beginner in contemplative prayer. That is to say, the contemplative experience is universal. One finds in each world religion a contemplative mystical tradition. But here we're focusing on how this contemplative mystical tradition manifests itself specifically in the Christian tradition. And one way of getting at this is by way of a certain understanding of what it means to respond to Christ's call, follow me. Follow him where? From the vantage point of the contemplative traditions, to follow Christ all the way home is to follow him into a perfect sharing of his perfect awareness, of his perfect and eternal oneness with God. This following of Christ all the way home into the bosom of the Father, that is, this following of Christ into a perfect sharing of his perfect oneness with God, to the point that the mind of Christ awakens within us, the unitive mind that is at once the awareness of and the reality of the unitive mystery that is at once all that we are and all that God is. This following of Christ all the way home is not simply that to which we are destined beyond death as our eternal fulfillment, but rather it is a mystery to which we are to awaken as being already perfectly present as the true nature of the present moment. That is, that the destiny that lies before us, which is the destiny of eternal union with God, is discovered to be the true nature of the ground beneath our feet. It is discovered to be the true nature of the intimate texture of all that we really are, one with all the present moment really is. The Gospels make clear that Jesus was a man of prayer, that he would retire into the wilderness to pray. He would spend whole nights in prayer. the nature of that prayer, the substance of that prayer remains God's secret. And yet, in another sense, there are passages in the Gospels that are very revealing as to what the nature of that prayer must have been. When Jesus says, I and the Father are one, or Jesus says, he who sees me sees the Father, or Jesus says that his realization of his oneness with God is identical to his realization of oneness with us, so that he